Here's a comedy-centric moment.
I don't know why I just did, but anyway, enough of that. Let's talk about the history of stand-up comedy. So,
Sure.
you've done so many other things, and we're going to sort of work backwards with your life. Um, but let's talk about that because I saw the show and it's really terrific. I mean, well, you talk about it. Give us.
Yeah. So I had no interest in history until I became history. I got older and I got interested, and I Phyllis Diller was a friend, and I had a lot of conversations with her about it. And we both thought that Mark Twain was the first stand-up because he did these lectures and after dinner speaking where he essentially was just being funny. Actually, it was a guy named Artemus Ward was the first stand-up comic. It's a totally an original American art form. This guy started in the Civil War, and he taught Twain. He met Twain out in Virginia City during the Civil War, where Twain was a reporter for this territorial enterprise, and Artemus Ward was a big star. He was a huge star. This is not like some obscure guy that wasn't famous at his time. He was one of the first showbiz stars in America. He was huge. Lincoln was a fan. He used to sneak into the White House. He was a total road comic. And everybody complains, the airlines. Yeah, try a buckboard for 90 miles over rutted roads. They knock your teeth out. You guys would stop and they'd bleed when they peed because of the kidneys rattling around.
Oh.
I mean, the trains were rough. He traveled and he drank and smoked weed, and he was a total stand-up comic.
Pretty much like comics today.
And he was just a wild guy. He traveled with a kangaroo because he thought that was funny. He'd sit a kangaroo on stage. I mean, remember, this is 1860, so they were just discovering what Australia was about. Yeah, kangaroos. And he had this docile old kangaroo he got from a circus, and he traveled with it and set it on stage when I did these lectures. When he look, every comic, when you hit the zeitgeist of America, like when you go to what their fears and obsessions are. So back then, right, there was no safety social net. If you didn't work, you didn't get paid. If you didn't work, you didn't eat, right? So he played a slacker character, brilliant comedic relief. And he had jokes like, we must all learn to live within our means, even if we have to borrow money to do so. And so he was a brilliant. Yeah, it is. It's still a great joke. He was a brilliant guy. He died at 33. He died at 33 in England of tuberculosis, which they didn't really have the name for it yet.
Consumption.
He went there because the English had looked down on everything we had done culturally. They looked at us as the hick cousins across the water. Their idea of American comedy was a guy in a coonskin cap dancing to banjo music on stage. And he went over there and knocked them out. The royals loved him. The upper class loved him. The intelligentsia, Charles Dickens, all these people, they all loved him. When he did, and when he died, he had a funeral for a couple thousand people, a state funeral. And the London Times wrote an obituary. They said, this is an American original. We have never seen the likes of one man controlling the minds of an audience through sheer wit, just his wit. And so they stamped it as an original American art form. And
that Artemus Ward.
Yeah. I'm obsessed with the
guy. Have you heard of Artemus Ward before?
I've heard the name, but I didn't know the history. I didn't know much about him. No. So it wasn't until I watched the Rich's show that you learn a lot from the show about, especially early stand-up. Yeah.
Now, how did you research that, Rich? How did you?
I like I said, Phyllis Diller was a friend, and she was encouraging me to have a note here saying, write this book and it'll be in every library in the country. I have this note from Phyllis. And I thought Twain was the guy. And Twain wrote an essay in one of his books, Roughing It. I think it was Roughing It. And he said, this is the funniest man I ever saw. And he talked about how Artemus Ward taught him how to tell a story. He said, this guy was the funniest guy I ever saw. And it was really funny because, and you will relate to this as a stand-up, when Twain saw Artemus Ward perform in Virginia City, of course, he was a funny guy himself. They hadn't met yet. He's just a reporter and so he's delayed on his laugh because he'd watch the joke and he'd try to figure out what it was. And then he'd go, then he'd laugh, right? Because he was delayed. So he's throwing off Artemus Ward's timing, right? He's got this big hee-haw laugh, like every comic does, some sort of significant laugh. He's but he's behind the rest of the crowd. So he does this twice. The third time, Artemis Ward turns to him and says, "Somebody water that jackass." I mean, he was sharp. He's quick on his feet. He was everything.
Great crowd work.